Imagine a single 21-mile wide stretch of water.
Just 21 miles.
Right. It's this narrow, incredibly congested maritime highway. And, I mean, if just a few cheap, like, $20,000 drones fly over it tomorrow,
$1 trillion could just vanish.
literally wiped out of the global economy in a single month.
It's terrifying.
Yeah. And today's sources, they aren't about some hypothetical war game, played in a Pentagon basement.
Right, this isn't a simulation.
No, they are about a literal hostage situation happening right now at the Strait of Hormuz.
Where the entire architecture of global trade is basically being held at gunpoint.
Exactly. It's the absolute definition of a geopolitical powder keg.
We're looking at a scenario where the physical movement of the energy that powers your city, the fuel that brings groceries to your local supermarket.
The raw materials for the phone in your pocket.
Yes, all of it is just hanging by a thread. The waters we're navigating in this deep dive are incredibly muddy, and the stakes could not possibly be higher.
And to really understand how we got to this precipice, we're unpacking a fascinating, dense, and frankly, deeply unsettling piece of source material today.
We really are.
We have a transcript from Mario Nawfal's YouTube channel. And Mario hosts these massive, sprawling, totally unscripted conversations that can go on for hours.
Yeah, they're intense.
Very. And this particular transcript features an extensive interview with Larry Johnson.
Who is a former CIA analyst.
Right, former CIA and State Department official.
And, the dynamic between the two of them is really half the story here.
Oh, totally.
You have Mario, the younger media host,
Yeah.
who's actively trying to find a path to de-escalation, pushing for dialogue.
Right.
And he's colliding with Johnson, the veteran intelligence analyst, who is looking at the structural, historical forces at play and basically seeing almost nothing but red flags.
Right. It's a real clash of perspectives. Now, a quick heads up for you before we dive in.
Yes, very important caveat here.
Johnson makes some incredibly intense, highly controversial claims today. We're talking about Washington, Donald Trump, Israel, and Iran.
He really doesn't hold back.
He doesn't. You are probably going to hear things that make you uncomfortable regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum.
Absolutely.
So we need to be explicitly clear here. We are not here to validate if his claims are true.
Right. We are not taking sides.
We are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing these allegations. Our job today is purely analytical.
We're just looking at the source.
Exactly. We're going to deconstruct why these arguments are being made, how they're being leveraged in the current crisis, and, how they shape the broader geopolitical map.
We're looking at the blueprint of this conflict, basically, regardless of who drew it.
That is the crucial lens for today's deep dive, because you can't negotiate a future if you don't acknowledge the historical baggage that the other party is dragging into the room.
Right, you have to look at the history.
And in this transcript, Larry Johnson makes a very stark assertion about the baseline of trust between the United States and Iran.
What does he say?
He states that the U.S. has, quote, zero respect for Iran.
Zero.
Zero. He argues that the American intelligence and diplomatic apparatus essentially views Iran through this singular, highly reductive lens, right? Like just as an irrational nation of religious fanatics.
Right. The assumption from the West is that everything Iran does is driven by blind zealotry rather than actual strategic national interest.
Exactly. But Johnson pushes back on that hard. He claims that Iran, conversely, is actually willing to recognize the United States as a legitimate sovereign country.
He does. And he doesn't just leave it at, philosophical differences. He traces this back to a very specific, really dark chapter in the intelligence community's history.
Right, we're talking about the 1980s.
Yes, specifically 1980 during the Carter administration.
He laid out.
According to what Johnson claims, based on his intelligence background, there was a secret CIA finding in 1980 where the U.S. allegedly began actively working to undermine the newly formed government of Iran.
And how did they do that?
By throwing its support behind Saddam Hussein in Iraq.
Okay, let's slow down and really unpack that, because 1980 is the year the Iran-Iraq War started.
Yes, it is.
So are you saying the source implies Saddam Hussein wouldn't have invaded Iran if he didn't have a green light from Washington?
That is the absolute core of Johnson's argument.
Wow.
He's suggesting that Saddam felt confident to launch what became a brutal 8-year invasion precisely because he believed the United States had his back.
I mean, that's a massive claim.
It is. And the transcript details that the U.S. didn't just offer moral support.
Yeah.
The claim is that the United States actually provided Iraq with weapons of mass destruction.
Wait, actual WMD?
Yes. specifically the chemical precursors and the intelligence targeting required to use chemical weapons against Iranian troops.
Which is horrifying. I mean, we are talking about mustard gas, nerve agents,
Yeah, awful stuff.
the kind of warfare that literally melts lungs and leaves these intergenerational scars.
It is horrific.
Right.
And the irony here, as Johnson points out, is just profound.
Because of the 2003 invasion.
Exactly. The U.S., which decades later would invade Iraq in 2003 under the explicit premise of eliminating weapons of mass destruction, was, according to this narrative, the very entity that helped supply them to Saddam in the first place.
That is just a staggering contradiction.
And the casualties from these chemical attacks were massive. We're talking about tens of thousands of Iranians who were gassed, while the international community, largely led by the West, basically looked the other way.
So to put this in perspective for you listening right now, imagine sitting across the negotiating table from someone who handed your neighbor a loaded weapon to shoot at your house decades ago.
Right.
They stood by while your family was attacked, they never apologized, and now, decades later, they are demanding you sign a binding, restrictive contract limiting your own self-defense.
Yeah, how do you possibly build trust with that person today?
It's an almost insurmountable psychological hurdle.
It really is.
Yeah.
But this leads to perhaps the most fascinating piece of analysis Johnson offers regarding the Iranian mindset.
Which is?
He notes this profound restraint that Iran exhibited during that war. And it was a restraint dictated entirely by religious doctrine.
Okay, explain that.
Well, when Iran was being bombarded with chemical weapons by Iraq, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, issued a fatwa, a religious ruling.
Right?
And this fatwa declared that the creation and use of weapons of mass destruction was a sin in the eyes of God.
Wait, I need to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. Iran was actively getting gassed.
Yes.
They were taking massive casualties. Did they have the scientific capability to actually strike back with chemical weapons of their own?
Yes, they did. The source explicitly notes that Iran had the scientific, technical, and engineering infrastructure to produce chemical weapons.
Wow.
They could have easily retaliated with mustard gas for mustard gas,
Yeah.
but they refused. They viewed it as fundamentally against Islam.
That completely shatters the Western intelligence model you mentioned earlier.
Exactly.
If the U.S. model assumes Iran is a nation of fanatics, right, that implies unrestrained violence.
Right.
But if their religious ideology actually restrained their violence in the face of an existential threat and literal atrocities, that completely rewrites how you have to analyze their behavior today.
Precisely. If we look at the mechanics of Iranian strategy, surviving chemical attacks without retaliating shapes their modern self-image.
They see themselves as the rational ones.
Yes, they view themselves as a rational, restrained actor that adheres to a higher moral code even when their enemies do not.
But Mario pushes back on this, doesn't he?
He does. Mario Nawfal brings up a heavy counter-perspective in the interview. He mentioned speaking with other analysts who argued that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, is deeply ideological and explicitly seeks the destruction of Israel.
Right.
Mario points out that Iranian leadership has held councils to discuss plans to eliminate the Israeli state.
So Mario's saying, like, hold on, you can't just paint them as restrained pacifists when they're funding proxies across the region and shouting, "Death to Israel."
Exactly. And this is the constant friction in the source material. Mario is highlighting that extreme violent rhetoric is a reality.
Yeah.
But Johnson's counter-argument is that you cannot properly evaluate Iran's current negotiating posture, especially regarding their nuclear program, if you divorce it from the trauma of the 1980s.
Because of the hypocrisy they see.
Right. To the Iranians, the West's sudden panic over Iranian weapons rings incredibly hollow, given the history of Western-backed chemical attacks.
Which brings us perfectly to the shift from chemical leverage to atomic leverage.
Yes, the nuclear debate.
Right. If we're talking about weapons of mass destruction, we have to talk about the most massive geopolitical elephant in the room.
The atomic bomb.
Exactly. The conversation between Mario and Larry naturally pivots here, and immediately they highlight what they see as a glaring, systemic double standard.
They focus really heavily on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT.
That's the international treaty designed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons.
That's the one. And Mario points out a profound irony in the global security architecture. Israel, which is universally understood by the international community to possess a significant arsenal of nuclear weapons,
Right.
is not a signatory to the NPT.
Wow.
They have never signed it. They don't allow inspectors, and they maintain a policy of nuclear ambiguity.
Yet Iran, which is a signatory to the NPT, is subjected to the most crushing, unprecedented economic sanctions in history over its nuclear program.
Because
It's a classic case of like, rules for thee but not for me, written into international law.
Yes, Mario is essentially asking, why does Israel get a pass to hold nuclear weapons outside the treaty while Iran is sanctioned into the ground for having the civilian program within it?
And what does Johnson say to that?
Jones's response to this is deeply layered. He prefaces his argument by stating he is universally against nuclear proliferation.
So he doesn't want anyone having more nukes.
Right. He doesn't want anyone building more bombs.
Oh.
But he introduces a highly controversial strategic concept.
Okay.
He argues that arbitrarily declaring one nation in a volatile region can have a nuclear monopoly while actively denying it to their neighbors creates massive instability.
Wait, is he saying what I think he's saying?
He actually suggests that if Iran did possess a nuclear weapon, it might create a state of mutual deterrence.
He compares it to India and Pakistan in the transcript, right?
He does. He points out that India and Pakistan have deep historical animosity, they have fought multiple wars, and they border each other.
True.
But since they both acquired nuclear weapons, they haven't gone to all-out conventional war because of the fear of mutually assured destruction.
Right.
So Johnson argues that a nuclear-armed Iran might similarly deter direct Israeli strikes and vice versa.
Okay. I'm not buying that, and I have to push back here on behalf of you listening.
Oh, for it.
You are trying to map Cold War game theory onto the modern Middle East.
Right. It's a stretch.
India and Pakistan aren't actively fighting proxy wars across 5 different regional borders every single day.
Exactly.
The entire theory of mutual deterrence, the Nash equilibrium, it assumes that all actors will always act with perfect rationality to ensure their own secular survival.
Yes, the rationality assumption.
Right. So how does Johnson justify applying perfectly rational deterrence to a region driven by deep apocalyptic religious ideologies?
That's a huge question.
Does mutually assured destruction actually guarantee peace, or does it just guarantee that the very next miscalculation is the absolute last one?
That is the terrifying tightrope walk of nuclear deterrence, and your skepticism is exactly why many intelligence analysts reject Johnson's view entirely.
It's just a massive gamble.
Assuming perfect rationality in a hypervolatile region is a massive gamble, and the source material dives right into those deep ideological currents to explain his stance.
Yeah, he offers some highly critical views of Israel here, doesn't he?
He does. He describes Israel as a, quote, Zionist nationalist ethno-state. He claims that within its borders, only people identified as Jewish have full rights, while non-Jews are structurally treated as second-class citizens.
And he contrasts this quite sharply with his portrayal of Iran, which I found fascinating.
How so?
Well, he points out that despite the Islamic Republic label, Christians and Jews have lived in Iran largely unpersecuted for over 2,500 years.
Right. He really leans into that history.
He even mentions in the transcript that he's trying to set up an interview with a leader of the Jewish community in Tehran to, prove this point.
He is actively trying to dismantle the Western perception of Iranian intolerance.
Yeah.
Furthermore, Johnson vigorously disputes the narrative that Iran and its Shia proxies are the primary drivers of regional terrorism.
Really? Who does he blame?
He claims that Sunni extremist groups like ISIS or al-Qaeda are far more likely to carry out random violence and suicide bombings than Shia groups backed by Iran.
Interesting.
He even goes so far as to allege that Israel historically funded Hamas in its early days.
Wait, Israel funded Hamas?
That's his claim. He alleges they did it to intentionally divide the Palestinian leadership and prevent the formation of a unified Palestinian state.
Okay, so if mutually assured destruction is the ultimate physical leverage, the only tool left to sway international intervention is basically public outrage.
It's a
Which brings us exactly to how both sides are weaponizing casualty numbers.
The information war.
Yes. The transcript shows an intense debate between Mario and Larry over the morbid math of the conflict.
Right.
Mario brings up the argument that Iran has destroyed lives, and Johnson dismisses a claim of 5,000 dead Iranians, retorting instead with a staggering figure of 45,000 dead in Gaza in just 1 week.
What's fascinating here is how casualty numbers become actual ammunition in this informational war.
Yeah, they're not just numbers.
They aren't just statistics. They are deployed to establish moral high ground or to completely delegitimize the other side's grievances. Johnson uses the sheer scale of death in Gaza, to argue that the narrative of Iranian aggression is basically a propaganda tool designed by the West to distract from Israeli actions.
So there's this intense physical conflict of drones and missiles.
And an equally intense, totally unregulated war over the narrative running parallel to it.
Exactly. So, with all of this historical trauma from the 1980s, this glaring nuclear double standard, and this intense informational warfare serving as the baseline,
Yeah.
how on earth do you sit down at a table in Vienna or Geneva and negotiate a new deal?
It seems impossible.
Well, the transcript details exactly what Iran is currently put on that table, and it is explosive.
Yes, we are moving from the historical grievances to the immediate present.
Iran's non-negotiable 10-point plan.
This is where the abstract theories of geopolitics hit the cold, hard reality of global economics and military logistics.
Right.
According to Johnson, the current negotiations are entirely dead on arrival as long as the United States refuses to recognize these 10 points.
Right. Let's break down the big ones because they are absolute game changers.
Okay.
They want an immediate end to the war in Lebanon.
Point one.
They want a binding security guarantee of no more attacks on Iranian soil, the Houthis in Yemen, or Iraqi factions allied with Tehran.
Right.
They want all of their frozen foreign assets released, which the source estimates to be well over $100 billion.
$100 billion.
Yeah, with a specific immediate request for $23 billion to be unfrozen today.
Just today. Wow.
They want all U.S. sanctions lifted. And crucially, they demand the sovereign right to retain the ability to enrich uranium while remaining in the NPT and allowing IAEA inspections.
Let's clarify the IAEA piece because that is vital for the listener to understand.
Yeah, what is the IAEA?
The IAEA is the International Atomic Energy Agency. They are the UN's nuclear watchdogs.
The guys with the clipboards.
The guys with the clipboards and the 247 cameras.
Yeah.
Iran is essentially saying, we will let your scientists keep their cameras inside our facilities. We won't kick you out. But we demand the right to keep spinning the centrifuges and enriching uranium.
And the percentage of that enrichment is the whole ballgame.
Exactly. Under the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal negotiated under the Obama administration, Iran agreed to heavily restrict its program and cap its uranium enrichment below 4%.
So around 3.6% usually.
Right. That is enough for civilian nuclear power, but completely useless for a bomb.
Okay.
But after the U.S. under the Trump administration unilaterally walked away from that binding agreement, Iran eventually ramped its enrichment up to 60%.
Which is dangerously close to the 90% needed for weapons-grade material.
It's right on the threshold. But Johnson frames this 60% enrichment not as a frantic sprint to build a bomb, but as a calculated mathematical pressure tactic.
Like leverage.
Exactly. Iran ramped it up to say to the West, you broke the contract. If you don't come back to the table and lift the sanctions, we will escalate the risk. We will get closer and closer to the line.
But the West didn't flinch.
No, and now Iran is sitting at 60%.
And beyond the nuclear issue, point number 2 on their plan is demanding the complete withdrawal of all U.S. military bases in the region.
Yes.
And as Johnson points out with a bit of dark irony, Iran is actually achieving that demand organically.
Right, without even being at the table.
Exactly. By having allied militias constantly harass and attack those bases in Iraq and Syria, they're forcing the U.S. to evacuate outposts simply due to attrition without the U.S. ever having to formally agree to it at a negotiating table.
It is leveraged through exhaustion.
Yeah.
But the absolute crown jewel of this 10-point plan, the demand that has the potential to literally break the global economy tomorrow, is their assertion of sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz.
We need to camp out on this point for a while because this is the 21-mile-wide stretch of water I mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive.
It's the bottleneck.
The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. It provides the only sea passage from the oil-rich Persian Gulf to the open ocean.
Right.
Roughly 20 to 30% of the world's total oil consumption passes through this tiny bottleneck.
It's massive.
And Iran wants to claim sovereign control over it and charge a toll to any shipping company that wants to pass through.
And the justification they are using is reparations.
Reparations for what?
Well, Mario Nawfal cites a New York Times article in the transcript estimating that a recent month of bombing in the region caused between $600 billion and $1 trillion in infrastructural and economic damages.
$1 trillion.
$1 trillion. Iran wants to use the toll booth at the Strait to recoup those massive catastrophic losses.
$1 trillion in a month? I mean, the math is almost unfathomable.
It really is.
But Mario raises a massive geopolitical fear here. If Iran is allowed to claim sovereignty over international waters and set up a toll booth, what happens next?
The domino effect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What stops Turkey from doing the exact same thing at the Bosphorus Straits?
Right.
What stops Indonesia or Malaysia from locking down the Strait of Malacca? Doesn't conceding this demand rewrite the fundamental laws of international maritime trade for every single country on Earth?
It opens Pandora's box. If you normalize the sovereign control and taxation of international maritime choke points, you unravel the entire premise of free global trade that the U.S. Navy has guaranteed since World War II.
Wow.
But Johnson argues that Iran isn't asking for legal permission here. They are dictating terms based on cold, hard military capability.
I think they have guns.
He claims Iran can permanently enforce this sovereignty because of what he calls asymmetrical area denial.
Let's break down asymmetrical area denial in tactical terms, because it sounds like, military jargon, but it's actually a terrifyingly simple concept.
It is.
It means you don't need a $1 billion destroyer to control the ocean if you have 1,000 $20,000 drones hidden in the mountains.
Precisely. You don't need a symmetrical force like ship for ship. You use cheap asymmetrical weapons to deny the enemy the ability to enter an area.
Right.
Johnson paints a grim tactical picture for the U.S. military here. The U.S. relies on massive, expensive aircraft carriers.
Yep.
But Iran has deeply entrenched drone launch sites and anti-ship ballistic missiles stationed up to 300 miles inland.
300 miles.
Yeah. If the U.S. Navy tries to sail a minesweeper into the strait to clear it, Iran just launches a swarm of cheap drones to overwhelm it.
And if the U.S. tries to seize a coastal island near the strait to secure the shipping lane?
Their troops are sitting ducks for missiles launched from deep within Iranian territory.
And the supertankers themselves, they are massive, slow-moving targets. You can't maneuver a quarter-mile-long oil tanker out of the way of a ballistic missile.
You really can't.
So to truly secure that waterway and stop the attacks, Johnson argues, the West wouldn't just need to control the water.
No.
They would have to invade and physically occupy 300 miles of mountainous inland Iran.
Which is a logistical, political, and military impossibility right now.
Completely.
The U.S. does not have the manpower, the domestic political will, or the resources to launch a ground invasion of Iran. So Iran has effectively created a permanent standoff.
They hold a loaded gun to the head of global shipping.
Exactly. And the U.S. has no easy, conventional way to disarm them.
This raises an incredible point about the shifting nature of power today. We are seeing a real-time transition from traditional naval dominance to asymmetrical area denial.
It's a new era of warfare.
Iran is systematically holding the global economy hostage. And as the transcript points out, it's not just crude oil.
Right, it's everything.
It affects European refined oil, it bottlenecks Qatari natural gas, it disrupts global fertilizer and food supplies.
Even the tech sector.
Yes. It even impacts the transport of helium, which is required to manufacture the microchips driving the AI boom. It is a literal chokehold on the modern world.
So if the U.S. refuses these 10 demands, but is simultaneously completely unable to militarily clear the Strait of Hormuz, what happens to the balance of power?
That's the billion-dollar question.
Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does geopolitics. If the U.S. is paralyzed, who steps in to fill the void?
The East.
Exactly. This brings us to a massive structural shift in the global order.
We are witnessing the East stepping into the breach. Johnson points out that while the U.S. struggles with military sustainability, funding debates in Congress, and, the rapid depletion of its own arsenals in Ukraine and the Middle East,
Right.
China and Russia are actively stepping up to assist Iran. This is no longer just a regional dispute over the strait.
It's becoming a primary proxy theater for great power competition.
Yeah.
And the details in the transcript are alarming. Johnson claims that China is currently supplying advanced integrated air defense systems to Iran. Furthermore, there are reports that China is preparing to supply significant amounts of man-pads.
Man-pads, man-portable air defense systems, like shoulder-fired missiles.
Exactly. These are highly lethal, easily transportable weapons that would massively upgrade Iran's and its proxies' ability to shoot down Western helicopters and low-flying aircraft.
But it's not just what China is giving to Iran, it's what they are actively withholding from the United States.
This is key.
Johnson notes that China is simultaneously restricting the delivery of rare earth minerals to the U.S. Let's think about why that matters for a second.
Okay.
Rare earth minerals are the Achilles heel of the U.S. military-industrial complex.
They really are.
You cannot build the guidance system for a Tomahawk missile or the radar for an F-35 fighter jet without them. China is basically choking off the exact supply chain the U.S. needs to produce and replace the very weapon systems that are being rapidly depleted right now.
It is a brilliant, ruthless double whammy. China arms the adversary while quietly strangling the U.S. capacity to respond. And Iran is playing this brilliantly from a diplomatic standpoint as well.
How so?
They aren't just relying on anti-Western allies like Russia and China. The transcript highlights how Japan, historically, one of the most staunch, reliable U.S. allies in Asia, is quietly cutting its own pragmatic deals.
Japan.
They are highly dependent on imported energy. Faced with the reality of the Strait, Japan sent ships to buy Iranian oil, bypassing U.S. sanctions.
Wow.
And crucially, they're paying for that oil in Chinese yuan.
Let's use an analogy to understand why Japan paying in yuan is such an earthquake.
I love a good analogy.
It's like the U.S. owns the only major toll road in town, the SWIFT international banking system.
Right.
For decades, if you wanted to do global business, you had to drive on that road, you paid the toll in U.S. dollars, and the U.S. got to see your license plate. By Japan choosing to pay Iran in Chinese yuan, China is essentially building a private, paved dirt road through the woods. The U.S. can't charge a toll, they can't stop the traffic, and they don't even know who is driving on it.
That is a perfect way to explain de-dollarization.
Thanks.
It shows that even close U.S. allies, when faced with the prospect of domestic economic collapse due to energy shortages, will choose their own economic survival over strict adherence to Washington's sanctions.
Yeah, survival first.
Iran is smartly isolating only the most rigid supporters of the West, while offering pragmatic back-channel deals to everyone else.
So the U.S. is standing there, holding its late fees, trying to enforce the old rules of a unipolar world, but the rest of the world from China to Japan is just quietly building an entirely new economic and diplomatic ecosystem around them.
Aaron David Miller, a former U.S. State Department negotiator who was referenced in the transcript, offers a sobering prediction that perfectly aligns with your toll road analogy.
What does he say?
He suggests that these grand U.S.-Iran negotiations might not end with a dramatic treaty signing on the White House lawn or, a dramatic all-out war. They might simply, in his words, wither away.
Just fade into irrelevance, like so many conflicts in the Middle East.
Exactly. It becomes a new normal. The rest of the world simply accepts the reality that Iran sets the maritime and security rules in its neighborhood, and countries bypass Washington entirely to make their own bilateral diplomatic and trade deals with Tehran.
Wow.
It's an existential realization that brutally exposes the limits of modern American power. The U.S. simply cannot dictate terms to the globe the way it could 20 years ago.
So how does Washington react to this terrifying realization that their power is waning and the global economy is being actively held hostage?
Well, the transcript takes a very sharp turn here.
Yeah, in the final act, it goes into breaking news regarding Donald Trump, who, in the scenario laid out by Johnson, is attempting to aggressively pull levers to force an outcome.
And the countermeasures being discussed in the source material are incredibly aggressive and fraught with the risk of global escalation.
Right.
The transcript notes an impending announcement from CENTCOM, the U.S. Central Command, the military hub responsible for the Middle East, regarding a sweeping U.S. naval blockade.
Right. A blockade on all exports from Iranian ports, covering the entirety of the Arabian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, supposedly starting on a Monday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time.
That's massive.
Yeah, the stated goal of this blockade is to impartially enforce an embargo against vessels of all nations to totally choke off Iran's ability to export a single drop of oil and generate revenue.
Essentially, the U.S. attempting to do to Iran exactly what Iran is threatening to do to the global economy at the Strait of Hormuz.
Fighting fire with fire.
It is a massive escalation of leverage.
But Larry Johnson completely dismisses this as theatrical, dangerous posturing.
He does.
He refers to Trump in the transcript as an, quote, orange knucklehead, and claims the sheer logistics simply do not support the threat. He states the U.S. Navy only has about 6 ships immediately available in the specific area for this kind of operation.
Only 6.
Yeah, while Iran could easily swarm them with 10 or more of their own vessels, not to mention the drones.
And Johnson raises the specter of great power escalation once again here. What happens if an Iranian oil tanker is being explicitly escorted out of port by a Russian or Chinese warship flying their respective flags?
That's a nightmare scenario.
Is the commander of a U.S. Navy destroyer going to fire on a Chinese military vessel to enforce a blockade on Iran.
That is exactly how a regional standoff over oil tolls becomes World War III in an afternoon.
Exactly.
But Johnson goes even further, making a massive, highly controversial claim about the real motivation behind these policy announcements from the Trump sphere.
Oh yeah, this part is wild.
He alleges that Trump uses these sudden, dramatic military announcements for explicit market manipulation.
The mechanics of this claim are fascinating and cynical. Johnson argues that by suddenly announcing a military blockade, absolute panic floods the global commodities market. Oil futures instantly spike into triple digits, perhaps shooting up to $140 a barrel on the fear of restricted supply, and the broader stock market drops in response to the inflation fear.
Let's break down how someone actually makes money off that panic.
Please do.
When a blockade is announced, an insider doesn't just go buy barrels of physical oil. They buy options, specifically call options.
Right.
They buy the contractual right to buy oil at today's price tomorrow. When the price spikes $40 overnight because the market is panicking over a war, they execute that right, buy it at the old cheap price, and instantly sell it at the new panicked price, pocketing the massive difference.
Exactly. And Johnson predicts that an hour and a half before the market actually opens on Monday, after the panic has peaked, Trump will suddenly announce, "Never mind, we negotiated, the blockade is off."
Just like that.
Just like that. The oil prices violently crash back down to normal. The stock market rallies. And according to Johnson's claim, insiders within Trump's political and financial sphere make billions of dollars on the engineered volatility through insider trading.
Again, we have to pause and address you directly here. This is a severe, unverified allegation made by Johnson.
Yes.
He is portraying American geopolitical brinkmanship as a literal cover for massive financial fraud. We are reporting the mechanics of his claim because it highlights the deep structural cynicism Johnson holds regarding the motives of U.S. leadership.
But we're not validating that this insider trading is actually occurring.
Absolutely not. But regardless of the why behind the blockade, if the U.S. does go ahead with it, the economic ramifications outlined in the transcript are bizarre.
Very bizarre.
Because while the rest of the world, particularly Europe and Asia, suffers from skyrocketing gas prices and crippling inflation due to the choked-off Middle Eastern supply, the U.S. might actually benefit in a strange, insulated way.
Yes. The transcript points out a wild economic paradox. The liquid natural gas, or LNG, export industry in the United States is absolutely booming because of this Middle Eastern crisis.
Wow.
As energy from the Gulf becomes unreliable, dangerous, or heavily sanctioned, U.S. LNG becomes the only safe alternative, making it highly profitable.
So there are powerful domestic economic sectors in the U.S. that actually financially benefit from the chaos in the Strait.
It is a deeply tangled web of incentives. But the conversation also touches on another massive question regarding U.S. leverage. Why wouldn't Trump, in this scenario, simply force Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to end the war in Lebanon?
Right. Ending that war is point number one on Iran's 10-point plan.
Exactly.
If Trump has immense financial and military leverage over Israel, why not use it to secure the region and instantly de-escalate with Iran?
And here the source material wades into even darker, more sensational territory. Johnson alleges that the reason Trump won't dictate terms to Israel is because Israel possesses devastating blackmail material on him.
And specifically, the transcript mentions the Jeffrey Epstein network.
It does.
Johnson claims there are explosive revelations coming from a woman named Amanda Unaro, who is described in the source as an ex-friend of Melania Trump.
Right.
According to the transcript, Unaro's ex-husband, a former Trump official, allegedly used his political connections to have her deported. And the core claim Johnson makes is that Unaro possesses hard evidence of Trump engaging in illicit activities with underage girls, tying directly back to the Epstein network.
And he claims Melania's recent actions are related to this.
Yes, Johnson asserts that Melania Trump's recent, highly publicized public statements were actually a calculated PR attempt to get ahead of this damaging story before it broke.
We must reiterate our impartiality here with extreme prejudice.
Yes.
These are entirely unverified, highly inflammatory allegations regarding blackmail, human trafficking, and illicit behavior.
Absolutely.
However, structurally, within the analysis of the transcript, Johnson uses these claims to explain a perceived paralysis in U.S. foreign policy. He is arguing that U.S. strategic decisions in the Middle East, specifically the inability or refusal to reign in Israel, are fundamentally compromised by the personal, hidden vulnerabilities of its leaders.
It paints an incredibly bleak picture. He is describing a superpower that is not only militarily overextended by asymmetrical warfare and economically challenged by a rising Asia, but fundamentally compromised and paralyzed at the executive level by blackmail.
It's a very dark assessment.
So, with apocalyptic economic scenarios at the Strait of Hormuz, shifting global powers, and alleged blackmail running rampant in Washington, we have to ask, is there any off-ramp?
Is there hope?
Yeah, we've looked at the blueprint of a disaster. Does the source material offer any hope, any pragmatic middle ground that avoids a trillion-dollar collapse?
Surprisingly, yes. Even amidst all the deep cynicism and historical fatalism, Johnson outlines a very pragmatic, purely political pathway for Trump to secure a win and de-escalate.
Okay, I need some optimism right now. Let's hear the off-ramp. What does a viable solution actually look like?
Johnson suggests that Trump could completely bypass the traditional, slow-moving diplomatic channels in Geneva.
Okay.
He could fly directly to the region, meet with Iranian leadership, and offer a grand, highly publicized bargain.
What's the bargain?
The core of it would be this. The U.S. officially, publicly recognizes Iran's sovereign right to enrich uranium for civilian power, but Iran agrees to strictly cap that enrichment at a low level, say, 3% to 10%.
So the U.S. acknowledges their sovereignty, which satisfies Iranian pride, but mathematically removes the weapons threat, which satisfies Western security fears.
Exactly. And in exchange for that verified hard cap on enrichment, the U.S. would immediately lift the crushing economic sanctions as a show of good faith.
It makes perfect sense politically. I mean, it would allow Trump to stand on a podium and claim he did what Obama couldn't, right?
Exactly.
He secured a permanent binding agreement rather than the 10-year sunset clauses of the original JCPOA, and he definitively, quote, stopped the Iranian nuclear threat.
It gives his administration a massive, legacy-defining foreign policy victory to run on.
And crucially, it prevents the collapse of the global economy at the Strait of Hormuz.
It is a cold, transactional solution to a deeply ideological conflict. But perhaps the most compelling part of the transcript regarding finding a quote-unquote middle ground comes not from Johnson's geopolitical strategy, but from Mario Nawfal's own philosophy of media, dialogue, and human connection.
I found this part so fascinating because it completely shifts the tone.
It really does.
Mario really pushes back against the concept of digital echo chambers. He talks about his experience hosting these massive live audio spaces on X, formerly Twitter.
Right.
Instead of letting people yell into the void, he is intentionally trying to bring opposing, bitterly divided sides into the exact same digital room.
He shares a profound, really heavy anecdote from the early days of the Gaza war. He hosted a space where he managed to get an active Israeli IDF pilot and a journalist reporting from the ground in Gaza on the same digital stage at the same time.
Right. And the journalist had just lost a significant portion of his own family to IDF airstrikes.
The emotion is so raw.
And the pilot is on the line, trying to explain the terrible, cold calculus of striking military targets, knowing there are civilian infrastructure like hospitals or schools nearby.
It's an impossible conversation.
The journalist is calling the pilot's actions barbaric. The pilot is defending his orders. But the crucial thing is, they are talking.
They aren't shooting.
Exactly. They are sharing their mutual traumas. They are discussing the sheer horrors of October 7th and the unimaginable horrors of the bombings in Gaza directly to each other.
Mario's ultimate goal, as he states in the transcript, is incredibly ambitious.
Yeah.
He wants to find a legal loophole to bypass international restrictions and host Lebanese and Israeli politicians who are currently legally barred from communicating with one another, or American and Iranian negotiators, at the exact same table on his platform. He wants to force genuine perspective-taking.
In a world entirely defined by blockades, sanctions, and 300-mile ballistic missile perimeters, Mario is trying to build a digital bridge.
It's a noble effort.
It shows that beneath all the grand geopolitical posturing, beneath the talk of man-pads and LNG exports and uranium enrichment percentages, there is this desperate, fundamental human need to just sit down and be heard by the other side.
It is a truly fascinating juxtaposition in the source material. You have Larry Johnson, the veteran intelligence analyst, who is deeply pessimistic.
Yeah.
He views the global actors as rigid, driven entirely by historical grievance, cynical financial motives, and raw military power dynamics.
Yeah.
He looks at the board and sees a system locked in a fatal trajectory.
And on the other hand, you have Mario Nawfal representing a newer, decentralized media landscape who retains this stubborn, almost radical optimism.
Exactly.
He believes that if you can just break through the state-sponsored propaganda and force human beings to speak to one another, dialogue can still uncover a middle ground. It's the old world's fatalism colliding with the new world's connectivity.
And that tension is exactly why unpacking this source material is so vital. It forces us to look at both the terrifying structural realities of the conflict and the human elements that might still, against all odds, offer a way out.
So let's bring this massive journey all together. We have covered a staggering amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started in the murky, tragic waters of history, looking at the 1980s, the U.S. backing of Saddam Hussein, and the deeply scarring use of chemical weapons against Iran.
We saw how Ayatollah Khamenei's religious fatwa restraining the use of those WMDs completely shattered Western assumptions and shaped Iran's modern self-image as a rational, restrained actor.
We examined the glaring nuclear double standard of the NPT between Israel and Iran and debated the terrifying, highly risky logic of applying Cold War mutual deterrence to a region driven by religious ideology.
We broke down every piece of Iran's non-negotiable 10-point plan, highlighting their demand for sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz to extract up to $1 trillion in reparations.
We analyzed the chilling reality of asymmetrical area denial, how cheap drones and missiles stationed 300 miles inland can permanently hold the global economy hostage, rendering traditional billion-dollar naval fleets nearly obsolete.
We watched as the global order violently shifted, with China and Russia stepping in to supply advanced weaponry like man-pads, while strategically choking off the rare earth minerals the U.S. needs to survive.
We saw the mechanics of de-dollarization, with Japan paying for oil in yuan, bidding a private dirt road around the U.S. banking system.
We parsed the breaking news of a U.S. blockade, the intricate mechanics of options trading and market manipulation, and the sensational, dark claims regarding political blackmail paralyzing Washington.
And finally, we looked at the narrow, pragmatic political off-ramp of a 3 to 10% enrichment cap and the desperate attempt by new media to force dialogue across impossible divides.
For you listening, the immediate takeaway is highly practical. Keep a very close eye on the Strait of Hormuz and the commodities markets in the coming weeks. Understand that the movement of a single oil tanker in a narrow strip of water halfway across the world is not an abstract news story. It is a mechanical lever that directly impacts the price of your groceries, the cost of your commute, and the stability of your retirement account.
Everything is connected. The blueprint of this conflict is the blueprint of the global economy. So I want to leave you with a final, lingering question to ponder on your own.
Yeah.
If we are truly moving into a world where regional powers have realized they can use cheap $20,000 drones to permanently hold the global economy hostage at strategic maritime choke points, are we witnessing the end of the open oceans?
That's a chilling thought.
And if the era of open, free maritime trade, the very foundation of the modern world since World War II, is permanently over, what kind of world are you actually waking up to tomorrow?